My name is Drew Bailey. I am an associate professor in the School of Education at the University of California, Irvine. Over the last few years, my research has focused on the long-run effects of educational interventions with a focus on early math-focused interventions. And basically, there are some educational interventions that have shown these really impressive long-run effects where the best estimates of the benefits of those interventions far outweigh their costs. At the same time, it's a very common finding is that after the end of an educational intervention, that effects get smaller. And probably our best guess is that for many interventions, in which children aren't followed after the end of treatment for very long, those effects are not detectable several years after the end of treatment. And one of the goals of my research is to come up with models that we can use to forecast down the line reasonably accurately which kinds of interventions are likely to produce long-term beneficial effects conditional on the short-term effects of the interventions. During my time here, I talked about two different projects that I'm working on. One on what happens after a successful educational intervention and how that might matter for leading that effect to persist or fade over time. I think a lot of people have this intuition that after the end of a successful educational intervention, if the subsequent educational environment is high quality, that will lead those early effects to persist. And I think it makes a lot of sense, and it must be true in some cases. But of course, subsequent high quality educational environments in some circumstances might benefit children who didn't receive the intervention. In some cases, maybe more than the children who did receive the successful intervention. From our review of the literature, it seems like probably there are some cases in which both of these things happen, and there doesn't appear to be a lot of regularity in when one educational intervention's impacts are sustained by subsequent high-quality educational environments versus when they are substitutes for later high-quality educational environments. So that's disappointing, but we have some recommendations that people might use to increase productivity in that area. And then the other thing I talked about, I just mentioned, was building these models to forecast the longer run effects of educational interventions based on the short run impacts of the intervention and some model, some theory of how development happens after the end of the intervention. I read John and Dana's NBER working paper on this topic, and I think they totally nail it on the head. The biggest, most disappointing consequence of this scale-up problem is that politicians or policymakers, decision makers, they pay less attention to this broad research base on the effects of interventions. And even sadder, this is a rational choice in some respect, right? Because they know that on average, these effects that are getting reported in journals or white papers or something like that are on average, they're not doing a very good job of approximating what might happen if the policymaker enacts the policy at scale. John and Dana's solutions, proposed solutions, I think are excellent. That we need and I think that this is probably almost certainly an economically feasible solution, that we need to invest in models that can, developing models based on data that can forecast what the likely effect of an intervention is going to be at scale, based on information about what the effect was in the smaller scale studies, how those studies were analyzed, the relation between the populations that were served by those earlier studies and the population of interest to the policymakers, the settings, et cetera. I think that is a totally worthwhile next step. I would also add that I think that building some of these features into the design of education or interventions more broadly is a promising solution. It would be more expensive, but I think we would get more definitive answers in some cases. So, for example, if we're worried about how best to ensure the fidelity of implementation, or whether fidelity of implementation might in some cases be less desirable than someone kind of on the fly adapting the intervention to better suit local conditions and populations, et cetera. We could fund an intervention to be implemented at a larger scale, maybe a medium scale or something like that, where at some sites the implementers are using one strategy, and other sites they're using another strategy, but it's the same intervention at both sets of sites. For one other possibility, I think that is relevant, is that if we are interested in this possibility of positive or negative spillovers, and John has a really compelling working paper estimating really enormous positive spillover effects of preschools on non-treated children's cognitive and non-cognitive skills. If those effects are anywhere close to what the average effects are more broadly, this is extremely important and also can be built into the design of experiments where if these spillover effects are that substantial, we need to probably be randomizing at higher levels and more regularly testing a whole bunch of untreated individuals around where the intervention is implemented. It would, again, this is going to be expensive, but I think learning one way or the other how big and predictable these effects are would do a lot of good. Most optimistically, we understand how to mitigate negative scaling effects. That would be great. And I suspect that it's possible to some extent, but at least a modest goal should be to have a better understanding of first of all what the effect is likely to be for, on average for most interventions of different kinds, but even better, what kinds of interventions will be less prone to this kind of scale-up effect and are therefore more promising for scaling up.